I was working the front desk at a hotel in Amsterdam when an American couple walked up to me, looking absolutely panicked. The woman slapped her hand on the counter and said, "We need to check out right now. This place is dangerous." I asked what happened, trying to stay calm. She leaned in and whispered, "There are drug dealers everywhere, just standing there in the open, selling illegal substances to children." I blinked. Then I realized what she meant. She had walked past a coffee shop, not a Starbucks, a Dutch coffee shop. I explained that cannabis is decriminalized here, and those shops are legal. She stared at me like I'd just told her the earth was flat. Her husband jumped in. "So you're telling me the government just allows this?" I nodded. He shook his head slowly and muttered, "No wonder America won the Cold War." These kinds of cultural moments fascinate me. The instant where two completely normal perspectives collide. I unpack stories like this every week. So if you're someone who likes to understand the why behind human behavior, you'll want to stay tuned. They didn't check out, but they also didn't leave their room for the rest of the trip. Another time, I was sitting in a train station in Germany when I overheard an American guy talking loudly on his phone. He was telling someone back home, "Yeah, the trains here are insane. They leave exactly on time. Like, to the second. It's so stressful. How are you supposed to plan for that?" The German woman sitting next to me looked over at him, then at me, and just sighed. I'll never forget that sigh. It said everything. My friend works at a restaurant in Paris. One evening, an American tourist asked him, "Why don't you guys speak English here? Like, everyone in Europe speaks English." My friend, who speaks 4 languages, just smiled and said in perfect English, "We do. You just have to ask nicely first." The guy didn't get it. He turned to his wife and said, "See? Rude. Just like they say online. I grew up near the border in Canada." One summer, an American family stopped at a gas station and asked my dad, "How much is this in real money?" They were holding Canadian dollars. My dad said, "That is real money." The guy laughed and said, "No, I mean like actual dollars." My dad pointed at the bill and said, "Sir, this is actual dollars. Canadian dollars." The man looked genuinely confused, like he'd never considered that other countries have their own currency. He paid with a credit card. These stories sound made up. I wish they were. But if you've ever worked in tourism, hospitality, or literally any job that involves travelers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not that Americans are bad people. It's just that sometimes the culture shock goes both ways. And when it does, the results are absolutely golden. That's exactly the kind of cross-cultural pattern I track. The small misunderstandings that reveal something much bigger. If you care about seeing the world with a bit more context and a lot less noise, this channel's built for that. I worked at a train ticket counter in Switzerland for 2 years. One afternoon, an American woman came up and asked for a ticket to Zurich. I told her the price. She handed me her credit card. I processed it. Then she asked, "Where do I tip you?" I said we don't accept tips. She looked horrified. "What do you mean you don't accept tips? How do you survive?" I explained that my wage is included in the ticket price. She stared at me for a long moment, then said, "That's socialism." She wasn't joking. A guy I know works at a hostel in Prague. He told me about an American guest who complained that the walls were too thin. The guest said, "I can hear people talking in the hallway at like 10 p.m. That's unacceptable." My friend explained that 10 p.m. isn't late in Czech Republic. Most people are still awake. The guest shook his head and said, "In America, we have noise ordinances. You should look into that." My friend said, "We do have those. They start at 11 p.m. The guest replied, "Well, that's your first problem. My cousin is a tour guide in Italy. She was leading a group through Florence when an American woman asked, 'Why is everything so old here?' My cousin said, 'Because it's historical.' The woman frowned. But like, why don't they just rebuild it? Make it modern? My cousin tried to explain the value of preservation. The woman cut her off. In the U.S., we just tear it down and put up a mall. My cousin said, I know. The woman missed the tone completely. I was on a bus in London once, sitting behind two American tourists. One of them said, why do they drive on the wrong side of the road here? His friend said, I think it's a British thing. The first guy nodded seriously and said, yeah, they're still salty about the revolution. I couldn't tell if he was kidding. Based on his face, he wasn't. A bartender in Dublin told me this story. An American ordered a beer and then asked, is this a pint? The bartender said yes. The American said, it looks small. The bartender explained that a pint is a standard measurement. The American shook his head. Not in America. Our pints are bigger. The bartender, completely deadpan, said, your pints are the same size. Physics is universal. The guy didn't laugh. My sister worked at an airport information desk in Tokyo. An American couple approached her, visibly stressed. They said, we've been here for 3 hours and no one speaks English. My sister, speaking perfect English, said, I speak English. How can I help? The woman blinked. Oh, well, why didn't anyone else say so? My sister explained that many people do speak English, but you have to approach them first. The husband said, that's so inefficient. I have a friend who managed a small hotel in Barcelona. One guest asked him, why is everything in Spanish here? My friend said, because we're in Spain. The guest replied, yeah, but for the tourists, you should have English. My friend motioned to the signs. We do. There's English translations under everything. The guest squinted. Oh, I didn't see that. He paused. You should make them bigger. Another train story. I was on a regional train in Austria when an American woman asked the conductor, how do I know when we get to Vienna? He said, it's the last stop. Everyone gets off. She nodded, but then asked again 5 minutes later, and again 10 minutes after that. By the 4th time, the conductor just said, I will personally come get you. She seemed satisfied with that. A co-worker of mine once helped an American tourist in Amsterdam who was confused about bike lanes. He kept stepping into them and getting yelled at by cyclists. My co-worker explained the lanes are for bikes only. He said, but there's no cars. Why can't I walk there? She said, because bikes use them. He replied, bikes aren't vehicles. She gave up. I was in a cafe in Belgium when I overheard an American ask the barista, do you have normal coffee? The barista said, what do you mean? He said, you know, regular coffee, not espresso. She said, we have Americano. He looked offended. Why is it called that? She smiled. Because Americans wanted espresso with water. He ordered tea. I taught English in South Korea for a year. One of my American co-workers asked me, do they speak Chinese here? I said, no, they speak Korean. She said, right, but isn't that a type of Chinese? I explained that Korean is a completely different language. She looked skeptical. Are you sure? I was sure. A friend of mine works at a museum in Berlin. An American tourist asked her, is this where the wall was? She said yes. He said, why didn't they just drive around it? She thought he was joking. He wasn't. She had to explain that the wall surrounded the entire city. He said, that seems excessive. I was at a pub in Ireland when an American tourist asked the bartender, so, is this part of England? The entire bar went silent. The bartender, very calmly, said, no, this is Ireland. The tourist said, right, but it's all the UK, right? Someone in the corner muttered something in Irish. It wasn't a compliment. My uncle is a history professor in Greece. He once had an American student in his summer course who asked, why did the Greeks copy Roman architecture? My uncle said, the Greeks came first. The student said, are you sure? Because Rome is more famous. My uncle just sighed and kept lecturing. I met a woman in Budapest who worked at a tourist info center. She told me an American asked her, how far is Paris from here? She said about 14 hours by car. He said, That's so close. In America, that's nothing. She said, in Europe, that's 3 countries. He didn't understand why that mattered. A tour guide in Egypt told me this one. An American asked him, who built the pyramids? He said the ancient Egyptians. The guy said, yeah, but who really built them? The guide said, the ancient Egyptians. The guy leaned in and whispered, aliens, right? The guide just walked away. I was on a boat tour in Norway when an American woman asked the captain, do you have polar bears here? He said, no, polar bears live in the Arctic. She said, but isn't Norway in the Arctic? He said only parts of it. She said, so there could be polar bears. He said, there aren't. She didn't believe him. My friend works at a bookstore in Scotland. An American tourist asked her, do you have books in English? My friend, a bit confused, said, yes, most of them. The tourist looked around and said, oh, good. I wasn't sure if you guys spoke English here. My friend is Scottish. She speaks English. She held up a book. This is in English. The tourist said, I know, but like the Scottish language. My friend said, we're speaking it right now. I was in a cafe in Amsterdam when an American asked me, what language do they speak in Holland? I said Dutch. He said, not Hollandish? I said no, it's called Dutch. He said, that's confusing. I agreed. Someone I know works at a castle in France. An American tourist asked him, is this where Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake? He said that quote is disputed and likely false. The tourist said, but it's in the history books. He said, it's a myth. She said, well, it should be true. It's a good story. I was on a walking tour in Prague when an American in the group asked, why are all the buildings so European? The guide paused. Because we're in Europe. The guy said, no, I mean like old European style. The guide said, yes, because they're old. And European. The guy still looked confused. My sister lived in Japan for 3 years. She said Americans constantly asked her, do people here celebrate Christmas? She'd explained that some do in their own way. One guy said, but they're not Christian. She said, neither are a lot of Americans who celebrate Christmas. He said, that's different. A friend in Montreal told me an American tourist asked him, do you accept American money here? He said, no, only Canadian dollars. The tourist said, but we're so close to the border. My friend said, that doesn't change the currency. The guy handed him a $20 US bill anyway. My friend handed it back. I worked at a summer camp in Sweden. An American counselor asked me, when does it get dark here? I said, in summer, barely. We're very far north. She said, so the sun just stays up? I said mostly, yes. She said, that's not scientifically possible. I showed her the sun at 11 p.m. She said, this is so weird. I lived in Germany for 4 years. One day, my American roommate measured something and said, it's about 3 feet. I said, we use meters here. She said, I know, but I don't know meters. I said, it's about 1 meter. She stared at me. How much is that in feet? I said 3 feet. She said, why didn't you just say that? I gave up. A guy I know works at a pharmacy in France. An American tourist asked him, why is the temperature on your sign so high? He said, it's in Celsius. The tourist said, can you convert that? He said, it's about 75 Fahrenheit. The tourist said, why don't you just use Fahrenheit? He said, because we're French. My friend managed a grocery store in Canada. An American asked him, why are your gallons so expensive? My friend said, those are liters. The guy said, what's a liter? My friend explained. The guy said, that's un-American. My friend said, we're in Canada. I was at a dinner party in the Netherlands. An American guest asked why we weren't wearing shoes indoors. We explained it's a cleanliness thing. She said, but what if there's an emergency? We asked what kind of emergency. She said, like any emergency? You need shoes. We said we'd put them on. She kept her shoes on the whole night. A barista in Italy told me an American ordered a large coffee. She handed him an espresso. He said, "This is tiny." She said, "This is normal size here." He said, "Can I get a large?" She gave him a double espresso. He said, "Still small." She said, "We don't do American sizes." He left confused. I worked at a swimming pool in Denmark. An American asked me, "How warm is the water?" I said 24 degrees. He said, "That's freezing." I said, "Celsius." He said, "Oh, how much is that?" I said about 75 Fahrenheit. He said, "Why didn't you just say that in the first place?" My cousin in Australia told me an American tourist asked her, "When does winter start here?" She said, "June." He said, "That's summer." She said, "Not in the southern hemisphere." He looked completely lost. She explained the seasons are flipped. He said, "That's so backwards." She said, "It's just geography." I was at a restaurant in Spain. An American at the next table asked the waiter, "Why is dinner so late?" The waiter said, "We eat at 9 or 10 here." The American said, "That's almost bedtime." The waiter said, "We go to bed later too." The American said, "That's unhealthy." The waiter walked away. A friend who works at a gym in Switzerland told me an American member complained that the weights were labeled wrong. My friend said they're in kilograms. The guy said, "But I lift in pounds." My friend said, "You can convert it." The guy said, "That's too much math." My friend handed him a chart. The guy never used it. I was on a bus in Finland. An American tourist asked the driver, "Why is it so dark here?" The driver said, "It's winter. We're in the Arctic Circle." The tourist said, "Don't you have streetlights?" The driver said, "We do. The sun just sets at 2 p.m. The tourist said, "That should be illegal." My friend worked at a hotel in Belgium. An American guest asked, "Why don't you have ice machines?" My friend said most Europeans don't use a lot of ice. The guest said, "How do you drink soda?" My friend said, "Cold from the fridge." The guest said, "That's not cold enough." My friend brought him a bowl of ice. He was happy. I was at a gas station in Norway. An American asked me, "Why is gas so expensive here?" I said, "Taxes and import costs." He said, "In America, it's way cheaper." I said, "I know." He said, "You guys should fix that." I said, "We're fine with it." He didn't understand. A co-worker in Sweden told me an American asked her, "Do you have air conditioning?" She said most homes don't. He said, "How do you survive summer?" She said, "It doesn't get that hot." He said, "It's like 65 degrees outside." She said, "Exactly." He said, "That's cold." She said, "That's perfect." I worked at a bookstore in Ireland. An American asked me, "Why do you write the date backwards?" I said, "We go day, month, year." He said, "That's confusing. Month, day, year makes more sense." I said, "Not really." He said, "It does in America." I said, "Only in America." He bought his book and left. I was working at a tourist office in Vienna when an American asked me, "Why doesn't everyone just speak English?" I said, "Because we have our own languages." He said, "But wouldn't it be easier if everyone spoke the same thing?" I said, "Maybe, but that's not how the world works." He nodded, thought for a second, and then said, "You guys should really consider it." That conversation sums up a lot of these stories. It's not meanness. It's not ignorance, exactly. It's just a different perspective. When you grow up in a country as big and isolated as America, it's easy to assume your way is the default. That your measurements, your language, your customs are the baseline, and everything else is a variation. But the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. A German train leaving on time isn't strict. It's just punctual. A French waiter not bringing the check immediately isn't rude. It's giving you space. An Italian city preserving its history isn't impractical. It's honoring its past. I'm not saying Americans are wrong for being surprised. Culture shock is real, and it goes in every direction. I'm sure plenty of Europeans visit the US and think, Why is everything so big? Or, why do they refrigerate eggs? The difference is just in how it lands. And sometimes, when an American abroad confidently says something wildly off base, the reaction from locals is memorable. My favorite part of these stories isn't the confusion itself. It's the moment right after, that pause. When the person realizes they've said something that doesn't quite translate. Sometimes they laugh, sometimes they double down, and sometimes, like that guy in Vienna, they just keep going like nothing happened. I've collected these stories from friends, co-workers, and my own experiences over the years. And trust me, they never stop coming. Every summer, a new wave of tourists arrives. Every summer, someone asks why the coffee is so small, or why no one takes credit cards, or why the train schedule is too accurate. It's become a kind of seasonal tradition. You brace yourself. You prepare your polite explanations. And you wait for that one question that makes you stop and think, how do I even answer this? If you've ever worked in tourism, you know exactly what I mean. If you haven't, just wait. One day you'll overhear a conversation in an airport or a train station, and you'll get it. You'll hear someone say something so confidently incorrect that you can't help but smile. And you'll think, yep, that's going in the collection.